So the purpose of an achievement test is to see how well the student can learn, how well the student can apply information, how much the student has actually gained from whatever many years of education. Mainly because you want to place children in special programs, make sure they're getting the right education that they deserve. And who says what kind of education they deserve? And it's, well, Public Law 94-142, otherwise known as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This, I don't know if it was covered in the last session that went over laws, but these are sort of things that are specific to educational achievement, and I just wanted to touch on. The IDEA law sets 13 possible categories of disability that would require the student have special education. It goes from anything to sensory impairments, sort of like vision, auditory problems, impulse control problems, and it even includes like emotional problems. I forget what the term they actually use. So it's 13 different categories, and you can look more at that in Wikipedia, or the Sattler book does a really good job at spelling these things out. And the other thing that's important is it says that all students must be provided with free appropriate public education, or FAPE. Free is self-explanatory. Appropriate means that it takes into account any disability that they have, and they give them appropriate for their own level of ability to engage with a classroom. Essentially, like sort of what it spells out is the process for getting an IEP. IEP is an individualized education program. So when a child is suspected that they might have one of those 13 possible categories of disability, or disability we'll call it for now, even though it's not really that nice of a word. There's a student support service team that meets with a child, usually recommends further educational testing done by somebody that works for the school district, at least part-time. I've heard they pay really well, so that's actually a really nice gig for us to get. And then based on that, there's an IEP meeting that determines what accommodations are going to be given to a child. Is it going to be a special day school, a special class for a certain amount of the time? Is it going to be extra time in standardized tests? All those things are pretty spelled out. And if you've ever seen an IEP, it's quite lengthy, really interesting, and it spells out in a lot of detail the recommendations. Much more than we would in a sort of a private practice, or what we've been doing here. Another component of IDEA is the idea of the least restrictive environment, LRE, because we all love our acronyms. And that essentially says that you need to try to mainstream the child as much as possible. You wouldn't send a child to a special day school when a one period special ed class will do. And it's the idea that the services need to be the least restrictive, and you're trying to get them to be as close to the rest of their peers as possible for them. The other important law and regulation is Larry P. versus Riles, which I've talked about before, which limits the use and selection of tests for evaluation and placement. So it's really, the emphasis on placement is really important, because you can still do the WISC, and there are a lot of reasons why you would. But if it's for placement, you're not going to be able to use the WISC, the Stanford Binet, because they've been shown to be biased against certain ethnic populations, and so they can be used, but not for placement. Questions?
I'm sorry, what does IEP stand for?
Individualized Education Program. These are a couple other things that relate to, so we're done with achievement tests. And now we're moving on to these other things. So there are a couple issues that you need to be aware of when it comes to testing, especially sort of educational cognitive testing. And the first is the Flynn Effect. Have you heard of the Flynn Effect? So it's this really interesting thing that happens where you get a test, and then you norm it in a population, and you see that the average should be 100. And they set everything to 100. And then years later, or 10 years or a generation later, you use the same test, and you realize, oh, the mean is no longer 100. The mean is now 105. So what a lot of people have tried to say is that means that we're all getting smarter. And that's actually not necessarily the case, but at least we test smarter in these types of tests. So the idea that every generation will score better on the same IQ test, which is one of the reasons that it's really important to use the latest set of norms. And that's one of the reasons why these tests are periodically renormed. Because if you give the same person one WAIS, and then you give, they might test differently on the WAIS 4 than they would on the WAIS 3, than on the WAIS R. To get a sense of what those numbers are, if you look at the WAIS 3 manual, there is an average of 2.9 increase in IQ points for FSIQ between the WAIS R and the WAIS 3. I'm not sure what it is between the 3 and the 4.
So for the Flynn Effect, there's achievement tests, and academic tests, and cognitive tests. Which is the Flynn Effect an issue for?
So the question is, what test does this affect? And I've only seen it in terms of IQ, so only intelligence testing. But I mean, it's something to keep in mind. You need to be aware of it, know that it exists. It's hard to quantify, but it gets really, really interesting when you're testing somebody and you test them later with a different test. Like the WAIS 4 came out 3 to 4 years ago. So if you tested somebody 5 years ago, you're going to use the latest one, which is the WAIS 3, and then you want to test them again and you use the WAIS 4, you can't expect the scores to be the same. Even though, at least based on the WAIS R and the WAIS 3, it's not that big. It's 3 points, 2.9. The other issue that you need to be aware of is the expectancy bias, which is sort of one of those more cognitive psychology things where the way you treat a child and the way a person and the way they expect to perform will affect their performance. So an example of this is a study where they randomly divided a class into high achievers and low achievers, but it was completely random, and the teacher was made aware of these are the high achievers and these are the low achievers, and after some time the high achievers did significantly better than the low achievers, even though how they were split was completely random. So if a child that you're testing is always told oh, you're the dumb one, you should consider bagging groceries at Safeway because you're never going to go to college, it might become like a self-fulfilling prophecy, and there's nothing that we can do when it comes to IQ and educational testing to get away from that. There's a self-fulfilling prophecy based on how people see themselves. Questions about these two concepts or anything that we've talked about already? Okay. So more about DSM type stuff. So learning disabilities. Some people are really sort of strict about the difference between a learning disability and a learning disorder. We, as psychologists, will only diagnose learning disorders, not learning disabilities. Learning disabilities is a sort of a different concept. And that has implications in terms of the language that we use. And it's sort of expected that we use the appropriate language for what we do. So for instance, based on what I've presented so far, your diagnosis would be reading disorder if they have a problem reading. We don't diagnose dyslexia. We can talk about dyslexia, but we don't diagnose it. It's not a diagnosis. It's not in the DSM. If a person has dyslexia, chances are they will have a reading disorder. If a person has dyscalculia, they will probably have a mathematics disorder, etc. So we diagnose the learning disorders. It would go above and beyond what we have to do, sort of more educational school psychology, to look at like the different, because there are lots of different things that can cause a reading disorder. Even dyslexia, there are different types of dyslexias. There's the type where the letters are morphed, and it also has to do with numbers, and there's one where they just have difficulty putting words together. So it goes way beyond anything that we need to learn here, unless you're going to specialize in that. Usually also the dyslexia or whatever, it's more tied into organic problems, so more like brain impairment, where learning disorders, we don't care what it is, at least at this point. How do you diagnose a learning disorder? That's a question that is very likely going to be in the test, in the comps.
Repeat that question? How do you what?
What is required to diagnose a learning disorder? If the DSM is sort of tricky, because what it says, if you read the criteria, is a significant discrepancy between IQ and achievement. Now, what's a significant discrepancy? And it makes you actually read the entire chapter, because like in the third paragraph of the Introduction to Learning Disorders, it says, a significant discrepancy, while it can change, is usually considered to be 2 standard deviations difference. That's 15 points. No, 30 points. So, as far as and in general, we can say that in order to diagnose a learning disorder, IQ, FSIQ, or whatever measure we're using for overall functioning, and the achievement in the area that there might be a problem should be 30 standard score points apart, or more. Except if there's organic impairment, or if there's a processing issue. So it says, usually, for most people, it's going to be 2 standard deviations. But if the person has a processing deficit, then it's only 1 standard deviation that you need. 1 to 1.5. So, say somebody has visual motor problems. You're probably, or sort of a visual impairments. You're probably going to be able to use the 1 standard deviation definition. There are a couple, and the only types of learning disorders that we diagnose based on the DSM are reading disorder, mathematics disorder, disorder of reading expression, and learning disorder NOS. And that's about it for that. School psychologists often use this inter-test discrepancies to diagnose a learning disability. Not a learning disorder, but a learning disability. And that means, wow, their Wyatt has a standard score of 120 for everything except the oral language component. That's enough to say that there's a learning disability for them, not for us. Oh, I forgot to yeah?
Does it define processing issues? What is that?
So the question is, does the DSM define processing issues? No. But usually when there is any sort of processing issue suspected, there are a couple other tests that you can give. For instance, there's test of auditory processing skills, third edition. So the TAPS 3 is used for auditory processing, how well they can understand things auditorily and use that information. That's usually tied into like brain damage of some sort. There's also tests of visual perceptual skills, TVPS 3. That's for like any visual problems. There's a CTOP, comprehensive test of phonological processing, that is used also for auditory skills. So there's other testing that we can do to determine that. And other than auditory and visual, I don't think I've seen much testing for other types. So now ADHD. We talked about. Okay, so what's the diagnostic criteria? You can read about it in the DSM. It essentially says that there are two types of ADHD. There's predominantly an attentive type, and then also the hyperactive type. That's very important to know because sometimes, especially girls, small girls, they fly under the radar because they're not hyperactive, so they are so well behaved that nobody suspects, but they're performing really badly, and it's because they like sort of daze off and don't really pay attention. And it's not a learning problem; it's an attention problem. Usually, it's something that is sort of developmental, not acquired. So it has to start before age 7, so 6 or lower. And you need like 6 of the different criteria for either hyperactivity or inattentiveness. So we already talked about this, but what would you expect on the WISC-4 profile? So as we mentioned before, usually a lower PSI, which involves a lot of sustained attention. The VMI is typically fairly high, unless there are other issues that might bring the VMI low. Usually you should expect the WMI to be somewhat low. And as I mentioned before, like a lot of intercept as scatter. You can't diagnose ADHD just based on the WISC. So usually there are a couple other things that you need to do. There are self-report inventories that are given to the parents and or the children. Connors 3 are rating scales that Zoe will talk about next week, in the 23rd, I believe. And it's just like the parents saying, like, do you observe these behaviors? And the Connors scales are really about ADHD symptoms. The CBCL, the Child Behavior Checklist, can also be used since it has a scale for hyperactivity and inattention. Usually in order to diagnose, though, a lot of people, and it's probably not all that awesome, but a lot of people just use WISC, achievement, and the Connors 3, for instance, to diagnose. But if you really want a thorough assessment and really want to be confident that a child has ADHD, you definitely want to use another measure of attention. Two of the ones that are most commonly used that are computerized are the Connors Continuous Performance Test, which essentially requires the child to press the space bar depending on certain letters that come up on the screen. So it takes about 15 minutes, and you press the space bar after every X, except if the X comes right after an A. So it measures ability to attend to the stimuli in a sustained way, but also the ability to inhibit responses. And that's where I score really, really low. The other one is the TEACH, the test of everyday attention for children, whereas the Connors CPT takes about 15 minutes, the TEACH takes about over an hour, but it has a lot of different subtests that are sort of useful for other things. If you don't have these, there are other measures of sustained attention, that can be used, such as, you don't have to know these, the digit vigilance test and the Ruff's 2s and 7s, which essentially require crossing out a certain numbers really quickly in a lot of other things. So there are different ways of measuring it that don't require a computer and expensive software, but usually the gold standard is the Connors CPT or the TEACH. Are there any questions about that?
possible for you to, like, when you're talking, just be a little bit that way, because I can't see.
Can I?
Oh, I didn't think about that.
Yes.
I just hear it.
Any questions about ADHD or anything so far?
Well, can you step to the left real quick? I'm sorry. My left, your right.
Okay. What if I just sit down?
That'd be good.
I'm just trying to see that last sentence.
Oh.
Oh, other measures of it.
Right. Okay. Is this better? Okay. So something that you probably you need to know is sort of a little bit about neuropsych. I know that you haven't taken a class, but the comps are not supposed to be a final exam for your assessment classes. They require a lot of studying on your own. So go through the reading list, which is good. But just briefly, like, and I've been trying to build up this before, so it's not all that intimidating when I talk about it now. But how would you use the Wechsler scales in neuropsychological assessment? WIS is the Wechsler Intelligence Scale. So it's a term used so that you don't have to think about, is it WIS, is it WISC? It's just WIS. So over time, every single development of a new Wechsler scale has a lot of neuropsychologists on the panel. So really, like, the Wechsler scales are used a lot in neuropsychology. Somebody asked about this earlier. Usually, when you look at these from a neuropsychological point of view, you look at each subtest separately, and you look at what its specific abilities, what, components in each subtest can be diagnostic for brain impairment. What that is probably beyond the scope of what we can hope to accomplish. Some things that you do have to know is the concept of hold tests. Hold tests are tests that don't change very much after brain impairment. So usually when somebody gets like a very awful traumatic brain injury or a stroke or a tumor, that it usually affects a wide range of functioning, depending on where it is. But there are some tests that are considered to remain pretty solid regardless of that. So you can use them to measure sort of like how well they did before, or they would have done before the brain trauma or whatever happened. So those are the whole tests. And usually the best one is vocabulary. Vocabulary is the gold standard whole test. Other people, for different reasons, might use information as well. So looking at the CHC model, the whole tests are the ones that rely primarily on crystallized intelligence. Because unless there's any like severe amnesia, people with brain impairment are still going to be able to tell you what a certain word means. So the whole tests are probably primarily vocabulary, information as a secondary one. Other tests are going to vary depending on where the brain impairment is. If the brain impairment is sort of on the sort of right parietal lobe, you're probably going to have a lot of issues in block design, but not so much in any VCI. If the issue is more frontal, you're probably going to see issues in like matrix reasoning and similarities equally. So, and that again, that's going beyond, but the idea of you look at specifically what the tests are measuring for, and vocabulary is the best whole test. Another thing that is important to distinguish when it comes to the Wechsler scales for neuropsych is how do you differentiate between dementia and pseudodementia? Pseudodementia being the cognitive slowing that is caused by depression, very severe depression. And different people have different ideas about how to do this. Some people say that if you really are a good examiner, then pseudodementia or depression is not going to come into this at all. Like if you give them a lot of encouragement. But essentially dementia, the pseudo-dementia, the depression dementia, is going to come out more in more in things of immediate attention. Sort of like you're going to see more WMI deficits because they're not thinking about that. Also the PSI. Whereas when you see dementia, you're just going to see an overall decrease. Does that sound about right? And often when you're screening, you're trying to do a screening for both of those. If somebody says, "Oh, I don't know," you don't want to just say, "Okay, let's move on to the next one." You're like, give it your best shot. See if you can get it right. Because oftentimes pseudo-dementia, they can get over it. So I think that's all I wanted to say about that. Or at least all I know about that. There are a couple other neuropsychological tests that you need to have general knowledge about. Well, first of all, let's talk a little bit about, you need to know a little bit about the different batteries of neuropsychology tests. The first two are the ones that are sort of like the gold standard, what most people know. They're the Luria, Nebraska, which is, huge list of different specific items that look for specific areas of brain impairment. And the other one is a Halstead-Rattan battery, which has about 12 different tests, including the Wechsler scales. And it's it's very widely used.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
So for this great comps test, we need to know all these tests that you're giving us, like right there, like the neurological test. We need to know about every one of these.
So the question is, how much do you need to know about these for the comps? At least recognize them and know what they measure. So general knowledge. They're probably not going to ask you what Luria item 99 measures and what it means if somebody has a T-score of 40. But you do have to say, which of these tests is used to diagnose brain impairment. And you're going to have Luria, Nebraska, and a bunch of others. Just pinpoint that as a neuropsych test. Some other batteries that are used, there's a repeatable battery for assessment of neurological status, which is a glorified mental status exam, and that's sort of a screener. And another one that's really good is a neurological assessment battery, NAB. Some other neuropsych tests that you need to be somewhat familiar with is the WIMS-4. That's Wechsler memory scales. That is essentially if you suspect there's any memory impairment. It's a full hour to an hour and a half long test only for memory. So tell them a story, have them repeat it. Then wait 20 minutes and have them repeat it again to see, short-term memory, longer-term memory. Then you give them true or false items. Was the person from this story from San Francisco, yes or no? So it's maybe they have it in them, but they can't access it, so you're looking for recognition of items. And it assesses for verbal memory, non-verbal memory, sequencing memory. Yeah. In both immediate recall, delayed recall, and recognition recall. Another test that's similar to the WIMS is the RAML, the Wide Range Assessment of Memory and Learning. I like it better than the WIMS. And the CMS, the Children's Memory Scales. Trails A and B is part of the Halstead-Rattan battery, and it's you might have used that one already because it's very simple. There's one where you just have to trace, use a pencil and mark circles in order, in numbered order, so 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, and then that's Trails A. Trails B has letters and numbers. So the person goes from the start point 1 to A to 2 to B to 3 to C. They're usually used. They're very sensitive instruments to measure brain damage. The difference between Trails A and B is helpful for looking at other aspects of impairment. The Bender, or the Bender-Gestalt visual motor test, requires copying a set of figures in different cards and then copying them later. And it's essentially a test of like the copy part, like how well they can copy conceptualized figures, and also a nonverbal memory, how well they can remember those later. The Beery VMI, which stands for Beery-Buchtanica Visual Motor Integration Test, is in a way similar to the Bender in that it has a bunch of figures and then the person has to copy them. So it really looks for different visual motor skills, how well they can perceive things, how well they can like copy them. So it's a visual test, a motor skill, and a motor test, and how well that process can go on. Those are essentially the ones you need to know. Not a lot about them. Know generally what they do. So like memory, general impairment, sequencing, and set shifting, visual motor integration. And that's it.
Can you bring it back up to for a second?